Officer down! I repeat, officer down!
Welcome back to 1033. This is your host, Nathan Kapler, a podcast created for a first responder by a first responder. If you are not a first responder, you still are welcome. This podcast is aimed directly at trauma and post-traumatic stress disorder. PTSD is complex and often misunderstood. Our brave men and women who serve our communities often end up with behavioral and psychological issues as a result of experienced trauma from their careers. My goal is to share what I know, my personal experience with PTSD as a retired police officer, and continue to advocate for mental health while providing support to those still in their careers. This podcast is not a substitute for professional medical help, and I strongly suggest if you are in fact suffering, you seek out professional medical advice. Please join me on this episode as I continue to expose the reality of PTSD challenges. I hope you enjoy this week's episode. Welcome back to 1033. Today we have the honor of meeting a paramedic from Manitoba. This lady has been through it all. She is a mother, she is a paramedic, she is a wife. She was not diagnosed with PTSD, but due to her service and her contribution to her community, definitely has experienced enough trauma. Now, she believes that she was able to get the help that she needed before the issue became much worse, which is fundamental in her own success. Now, we're not going to mention her by name, but we are going to welcome her to the show. Thank you for being here. It is great to see you. How are you doing today?
I'm great. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. I was honored to kind of welcome you onto the show because I know you and I've known you for years now, which is kind of a treat, right? When you can see kind of a closer friend come on and share your story. Like there's so much beauty in that. So before we dive into kind of who you are, what you've been through, all the beauty behind the story, I want you just to take a quick moment and just kind of tell us kind of how you got into being a paramedic, who you are, and kind of where the journey begins, if you don't mind.
Not at all. I grew up in southern Manitoba. I have 3 beautiful girls, age 5, 2, and 7 months. I'm married to a wonderful man who is very much keeps me grounded. And I always knew I was going to be a paramedic. There was never any other thing. I grew up, I don't know if you guys, I'm going to age myself here, but the show Rescue 911. It was we had Farmer Vision. I think we had 3 channels, but it was on every Tuesday. And my mom said as a 4 or 5-year-old, I would sit and I'd watch Rescue 911, and I was just mesmerized by it. So I just always knew I was going to do it. And then I did a few things beforehand, knew I wanted to really experience life before I got into a career. So at about 22, I went to my schooling and I became a paramedic, and I started working in rural Manitoba in about 2011.
The journey begins. Interesting too how when we grew up, I grew up in northern Alberta, so I can remember kind of those restrictive moments at life where you had 3 channels and there wasn't much on. So what was on, you were grateful for what was on, and you sat and you watched these. Probably, if you watched them now, they'd probably be not the best shows whatsoever. But interesting how that seed is planted in us in a very young age, right? And your parents now can look back at you and say, oh yeah, this was part of your childhood. You saw these shows. It was very clear that you were very driven to help others. And I've known you for years, and that's kind of who you are. Like, you're a very caring, compassionate individual, and you really love the people around you. And there's a deep sense of, you're able to give them the care on a very different level, because it takes a very special person to want to become a paramedic. Would you agree?
Yes, definitely. It's definitely a career that is a very particular type of person can do it. I'm an Enneagram 7. So for the Enneagram 7s out there, you just can't handle anything that's just boring and stagnant. So paramedic was the direct path.
Yeah, and you've been doing this for 10 years, and you've also gone on to not only that, but in that time have 3 beautiful kids. The story behind that too for women, my hat always goes off to women who are in the field, who are serving their communities, but also behind the scenes, their moms. 2 very
Yeah.
big challenges in life. So before we dive into some of those challenges and kind of where this all happened, I'd love to hear kind of maybe some of those first traumatic calls that you went to, some of those things that you now reflect on and you go, okay, that definitely impacted me. Because I think you going into the career and knowing you were very caring, you were very compassionate. Quickly describe yourself too, and maybe some of the things you may have seen too that were changing because of the trauma, as well as you reflect on that, if you don't mind.
Yeah, for sure. I would say, you know what, those early years, you kind of go in, and I'm sure you can identify with this, is with, rose-colored glasses. You're going to go in, you're going to be a hero. You're going to go in, you're going to go into all these traumatic calls, and you're just going to change it, and it's going to be an amazing outcome, and you'll be the one who did it, right? And then I learned very early on that that's not necessarily true. You get the odd call, but I would say a very career defining moment for me. I was maybe about a year in, and I went to this a head on collision. It was a drunk driver, and he had these 2 young girls with him, and he hit another man who was on his way to work. And I was very young. It was my very first traumatic calls. I had an incredible partner. He was a very seasoned partner. I distinctly, it was middle of the night too, which doesn't help. Um, somehow trauma just seems a lot more elevated at night. It's a lot worse because you're very alone. So I remember looking at him on the way to this call, and I said, I don't know what to do. I have no idea what I'm doing. If there's 2 of us and there's 4 patients, what am I supposed to do? And he laughed, and he looked at me and said, "Oh, you'll figure it out." so so I was like, okay. So we get to the scene, and it's I can recall, this was 10 years, and I can recall the weather, I can recall the smells, I can tell you exactly the way the road looked. I can recall every single little detail of that call, and just this incredible feeling of just being so overwhelmed, because there was more patients than there were medics. We had an awesome volunteer fire department, but they were deeply impacted because one of the deceased on scene was a good friend of theirs. So they were doing their job, but you could tell I remember looking at the captain, and his eyes were just, there was nothing. It was glass. His face was glassed over, and he was going through the motions, but there was no emotion behind it. So I would say we triaged. We went through. We found out who was alive and who wasn't alive. And thank God, my partner, who was amazing, he's like, he said, we know where the deceased is. I'm going to go determine that he's deceased, and you go find a living, kind of thing. So I went, and there was the drunk driver obviously was walking around as they usually are. And he had these 2 young girls in his car, and they were very, very, very injured. And we brought both of them into the ambulance. And autopilot took over. I did what I had to do. We found out our nearest ambulance was an hour out. So we were just doing everything we could do in that hour. And unfortunately, both girls did end up passing away, which was really hard. And the drunk driver was fine, aside from a few injuries. But we ended up transporting him to the hospital, and I can recall I recall so many details of that call. And it's funny how even 10 years later, the year the ambulance we were in was 2009, and they had a distinct smell about them. I remember that, and I think about 5 years until they took all the 2009s off the street. Every time I got into a 2009, I'd get this sick, nauseous feeling in my stomach rise up, because all of the details that night just came back. So yeah, from that point, and it was funny how we got off the call finally around 8 a.m, and I was done my shift. I was going to go home, and my partner's like, "Hey, you want to sit and talk about it?" And I was like, "Well, I don't really know what to talk about." I was very young. I didn't really know. And he's like, "Okay," and that was that. That was it. That was the end of the call. I never, ever sought help. I never talked to anybody about it. And it's funny because actually over the years, I ran into different people who were all involved in that call. And it was really good to kind of rehash it over the years because I ran into like a respiratory therapist who was at the hospital the night they brought in the 2 patients, and he was able to give me some details and so stuff like that. But I would say not dealing with it was very difficult, and I definitely should have, because I still have issues. I still have moments. I was at actually an event a few years ago, and one of the girls who passed away, her parents were speaking at this event, and I had to look at these people and interact with them, and basically I couldn't tell them that I was there and that I saw their daughter. I pulled her out of the car, and it was those little moments make it very hard.
Absolutely. You were so involved in the moment, and yet you weren't allowed to talk about it because of the role that you play in the community. Not only that, but you weren't also able to process a lot of the emotions at the time. In very similar experience, I think one of the traumatic calls that I went to as well, I really reflected on just how overwhelmed I was in the moment as I was watching someone die in front of me. And the movies don't prepare you for that. Training doesn't prepare you for that.
No.
When you go through this stuff, and like you said, even on the drive there, the fear and the anxiety of, I don't know what I'm going to. I don't know how I'm supposed to do this. All very real feelings that we feel on the way to those calls. Now, years later, you've gained the experience, so that feeling isn't probably there as much, but you're still going to help people that are severely hurt. And I mean, there's always a cost to that, right? Every single call we go to, we still feel that. Sometimes we just get a little bit more used to it. So for you, some of the feelings that came out of that very serious call, how and when did you recognize that you needed to process those feelings?
I would say in the weeks following, I incessantly Googled the patients, which I know now, as 10 years on the job, don't do that. You don't it's you, you don't look at them. It sounds awful, but it's a coping mechanism. Every call I go to, it's really difficult and there's something bad that happens. If I don't see them as human, I can process better, that they were, and I would say as soon as I start humanizing patients and finding out that they have family and they had loved ones and they had a purpose and they had drive and they had, that's when it really starts to deeply affect me. So I would say the weeks after this, I would Google and I would try to I would read obituaries and I would, and then I was realizing I haven't processed this. I haven't dealt with this. This needs to be dealt with, or this is just going to grow and grow and grow and grow. So that would say that was when the point of and then, like I said, and every time when I would get into that year of ambulance and that sick feeling.
So yeah, let's just dive back into how you began to process some of these emotions. And I think too, even just what you spoke of now was very much the realization that you learn this, and I learned this too, even in my own experience after that first traumatic call, that feeling of being overwhelmed and seeing someone pass in front of you or in your arms, that feeling is too much.
Yes.
So you actually almost begin to say, okay, how do I do this so I don't feel that kind of pain or take on that energy or whatever the environment is that you're in at the moment? I think we all naturally start to almost detach ourselves from reality in order to be able to do the job. We almost seek to almost numb out or push our emotions down so that we can control them a bit so that we can do our job. Would you agree with that?
Oh, 100%, 100%. Because I would say in the last 5 years or so, I've been to lots of traumatic calls, probably not as many as my early years, probably, but I can't really recall them anymore. I can't tell you the bad calls I've had in the past 2 years. They kind of just tend to
we
numb them. Yeah.
Block it out.
Yeah, block it out. Exactly. And it gets easier for sure, And I said I stopped finding out these people's personal, I stopped trying to learn about who they were. Because as soon as I made them too human, then I started to feel a lot of the heaviness.
Yeah, very normal. Very normal. I went through a lot of the same things as well, even myself. And there's no shame in that. I mean, this is kind of how we initially, when we're in this environment and we're trying to cope with the serious things we see, we try to find a way to cope, right? So how did you, going back to that first call, do you want to share another traumatic story that you went to that maybe nudged you along the process of realizing that, no, you actually have to go and find help or start talking about this? Or like, how did you get to a point now where all of a sudden you're like, okay, I need to start working with someone and getting this stuff out?
Well, I would say maybe about a little bit more on the job. So maybe about 2 years later, I was at a really traumatic call as well, where it was a stillbirth, and there was a mistake made, and the baby was not deceased, and a call had been made that the baby was deceased, and we didn't find out that the baby was still alive until we got to the hospital, and proper care hadn't been taken. I mean, the baby would not have survived, but it was still breathing, and the mother was just livid, obviously, as any mother would be if you lost your child. And, I mean, she wasn't full term, but and the father also very and I remember that night so well, because the mistake wasn't me and my partners, it was made from someone else, but we were there and we experienced it. And I would say that that night, it was us again. It was a night, which nights are never good for that kind of stuff. And there was no critical incident trained person on call that night, so we never really got proper critical incident management after that call, because my partner and I were both very, very upset by it, and we ended up both going home because it was a very upsetting call. And again, it just kind of disappeared. Like we actually should have sat down with a trained PTSD, we call it critical incident manager, but there was no one on that night, which was really hard. And so I would say that was around that time is when I really started to struggle. I would say I worked a schedule that was 2 days, 2 nights, 4 off. My day shifts were fine. I had no problem going into my day shifts, but going into my night shifts, I would spend the whole day lying in bed trying to sleep with just knots in my stomach. And they would get worse and worse and worse and worse before my shift. And by the time I left for my shift, I had slept in almost days. It felt like in days I hadn't slept. And I would say the feeling of, I'm sure people who've been in the shoes can understand that, the feeling of needing to go into an open field and to scream. You feel like you are so pent up and everything is so twisted inside you. You just need to go find the biggest open space you can find and just literally just scream. And that's what I would feel every single shift going into work, and often on my days off too. I'm a very social person. I love people. I'm always out and about, and I didn't leave the house. I would go home for my 4 days off, and I would sit in my house, and I would do anything, and I would just continue and deal with this feeling of needing to just scream. And that's the best way I can describe it. And it's just this like constant need to let something out. Like there's so much inside you need to let out. And I think that was when I really noticed something's wrong.
I just want to paint a very clear picture to the people that are listening. This story you're sharing right now isn't about casting blame on someone doing something wrong by any means. And we're not talking about that. What we're talking about is the unfortunate aspect to first responder work, which is sometimes, yes, mistakes are made. We are human. Mm-hmm. Sometimes we make mistakes. I believe for most people out there that are doing first responder work, whether you're a police officer, a firefighter, a paramedic, whatever the case is, that every single one of us try to do our best, mm-hmm. given the state mm-hmm. that we're in. And the fact that something did happen, I mean, should go without the opportunity to blame anyone for what happened.
I should add,
right?
It was a mistake anybody can make. There was a lot of chaos in the scene, and it was an honest mistake that could have happened to anyone. And you're right, we are also human.
Yeah. And I mean, the intention behind that individual that, was probably trying to do the best given the scene. And this is the other thing I learned too as a first responder is you don't get to judge anyone that's been at these scenes who has a story behind it. You don't get to tell them, why didn't you do things differently? Why didn't you do it this way? We really have to just be there for people that go through these horrific things because it's already in the past. It happened. We can try and talk about it later and learn from some of the mistakes or some of the things that maybe weren't done properly. I totally support that, but I will never get to a place where I judge someone for what's happened
Right.
or I blame someone for what's happened. And that's just to clear up that
Yes.
aspect of the story. This one thing, this story for me too, I know when I heard this through a mutual friend actually, and I just thought to myself, are you okay if I talk about the baby being in the bag for a while?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and I mean that really rocked me because this was. The infant obviously is called at a point that it is past. And that is what you are told. And you did, I believe, some type of checks or whatever it is. But eventually the baby is put into a body bag, correct?
Yes. Yeah. And to transport it. Yes.
Yeah. And I should have mentioned a trigger warning earlier, but here we are. Do you want to talk about the drive back to the hospital and the guilt that may be still there as a result of just all of this? And I mean, I don't want you to go super dark with your own guilt, but this is the guilt we carry because I'll let you tell the story.
I wasn't a mother at the time just yet. I think I had my daughter the next year, but I put myself in the shoes of that mother almost every time that I think about this call. And I think about it less and less, as years go on. But whenever I think about this, I think that the amount of guilt I feel that she didn't get to hold this child. She didn't get to comfort this child. She didn't get to, even though, the infant wouldn't have survived based on gestational period, but your mother, whether your infant passes away at 8 weeks or your infant passes away longer, like you're a mother, it doesn't matter. And she didn't get that. And I think about if that had been me, it would have absolutely broken me. And I deal with that a lot because I look back and I can't believe that, thankfully at the hospital, they did allow her that time, which was really great. And I'm glad that she got that time. It was really good, but she didn't get to have that on my time. And I just feel like sick about it sometimes. And like I said, it's over the years, I've forgotten about it. Not forgotten. I've put it aside, and I forgive myself and the situation, but
and I think too, one of the things I heard about was as you were going back to the hospital and the child being in that body bag and then learning after the fact that child actually still was breathing, still did have some signs of life. The guilt after of realizing that and feeling like, oh my God, like I wasn't connected to that little person. Could I have done something to help them? I mean, our mind goes so many different places as a first responder, right? And that guilt it can be absolutely horrific. And that's, again, not to say that you did anything wrong whatsoever, but as a human being who's caring and compassionate, who gets thrust into this environment where you're now doing this first responder role and you're now getting thrust into these situations, how could you not have empathy and care for something like that? It can be devastating for us. And I mean, now you as a mother too, you start to, blend your story into now having your own children too. And I'll let you talk about that as well. Some of the challenges that now come from that space as well.
Yeah, you know what? And that call was, I think that year I went to 3 stillbirths that year. And I would say I got pregnant with my daughter, yes, the year after, and then I went on to have 3 babies after. And but I carried an incredible anxiety through every single one of my pregnancies, knowing that they can just be lost so easily, and not to call myself not compassionate, because I am very compassionate, but and just to know that like people can come in, they can help you deal with it, and then they're gone. And then that the mother is still, as a mother, you're still there, you're still dealing with this, right? And I say seeing these calls put so much fear in me for my own children and for my own pregnancies. And that stayed with me. Like through every pregnancy, I was like, okay, I'd get to each point at each week, and I'd be like, okay, I'm one more week along. And I remember getting 30 weeks at one point and being like, okay, my baby will be viable now. I will have a viable infant. Because I remember going to the hospital with infants that we were trying to resuscitate and having, staff, the neonatologist come into the ambulance, look at it and be like, nah, not viable, and then walk out. And that fear in me was so strong. It was just incredible. I would say it didn't, and I thought maybe it'd get easier with each pregnancy, and it didn't. It was still always there. I remember every checkup where they'd find the heartbeat, I would just this incredible sigh of relief, and I would lie there sometimes all night, making sure I counting kicks, being like, okay, you're still kicking, because I knew I'd seen how easy it was to lose these babies. That I'd been there when people had lost their babies. It's very hard.
Extremely triggering, absolutely. And I think we often forget too of moms that go through becoming moms and growing humans, and later going on to birth them. Everything that you go through, even just by carrying that child and also being a paramedic, can be so triggering. You see how fragile life is, and now all of a sudden you're stuck with the anxiety or the fear or these catastrophic thoughts of things aren't going to go well, because I've seen this happen so much through my service, right? And we tend to kind of, again, start to believe that reality that things are going to go not well for us. And it such a hard place to be. Absolutely. So for you go through all of this as a mom, as a paramedic. When did you finally say, I need to step forward and start dealing with the things that I'm carrying? And I guess, what kind of person did you see now that you had become in that moment that you recognize now that you need to step forward and start talking?
Okay, so yeah, probably about 2014, 2015 probably, actually, where I was just a shell of who I used to be. I said I didn't leave the house. I didn't care to hang out with friends anymore. I'd have friends reach out to me and I wouldn't answer. And it came down to my husband, who said to me, he said, if you want to quit and go work at Starbucks, I would support you. And that was a huge wake up moment for me, for him to say, listen, like my husband's, he's a numbers guy. So for him to say, you can leave your well-paying job and your pension and your benefits and go work for minimum wage somewhere, was a very eye-opening thing, because he recognized that I was just not who I used to be. I wasn't the person that he married. I wasn't the person that he met. And he fully set me free. And then I was like, okay, I need to either I stay here and I deal with this, or I leave. That's what it came down to. So at that point, I would say I sought counseling, which was really, really from some trusted friends and trusted individuals who were counselors. And I wasn't at a point where I was totally broken yet. So they kind of said, basically what I knew. They said, you either take a step back or you leave altogether. And I didn't want to leave, because I had spent my life wanting to do this. And there's still a lot of me that loves it. And I still go to calls where I walk away and I feel really good about them. And I still love the people I meet through the job. And so I didn't want to leave, and I had put so much effort and time into this career, and I didn't want to start over something else. So, I was able to recognize at that point, if I kept going, I was going down a very dark path, and I don't think I would have lasted, or I would have just been a very angry person. So I was able to manipulate my schedule, which was the first step. I was able to drop down a lot of hours. I was able to stop working nights, and I would say that was the biggest thing for me is, and I know this is the luxury everybody has, but I was able to stop working nights because I found I could handle actually just about everything thrown at me during the daytime. Bad calls, you name it. During the day, when the world was awake and the world was also seeing this, I could handle it. But at night, when the world was sleeping and no one else was seeing what was going on except for me and a few other people, that's when I found I couldn't handle it.
Yeah, interesting, but also good that you recognize that these are your limitations. And you have to eventually come up with boundaries. Like if you want to stay in this race, and it's a longevity race, it's a marathon, you have to start thinking about, how do I do this? How do I get myself to 20, 30 years of service? And I think too, if I would have taken that approach earlier on, I probably could have stretched out my years of service. Now my story is the way it is.
Mm-hmm.
That's fine. I'm totally accepting of it. But when you finally then now recognize that you need to have some boundaries, or at least support around what you need from your career so that you can continue to stay as a paramedic, how did the organization respond to you coming to them with some of these ideas or requests?
I got a lot of I got some eye rolls. I got some well, you haven't been doing this very long. You really don't deserve to take this time to go back down to this kind of schedule. You don't really deserve to just be working days. I got a lot of that. Like, you're new. The new guys have to. That was the biggest thing. Is I think what bothered me the most was that the attitude of the older guys and the management to the newer guys was like, well, you should be picking up the bad shifts. You should be doing the hardest work. And I was like, it blew my mind, because I'm like, no, we're like literally eating our young. Like, we're destroying our young by forcing them into this schedule and into this, there has to be a better way to do this. Like, and that was the worst part, is I think I got a lot of like, oh, like, you can't hack it. Hey, you're just too, like, you just can't hack it. You're too young, or you're too, you had, I don't know, ideals. And that was really hard. And I dealt with a lot of shame in that, because I am even within my own, I think my family was kind of like, oh, this is always what you wanted to do, but isn't this what the job is? That was also too, I got a lot of people, this is just what the job is. I'm like, well, it doesn't have to be like this. Because it's a really great job. And I always remembered that my dad had met a paramedic when I was still in school, and the paramedic had told him, oh, come find me when your daughter's 10 years in, she'll want out. And that always stuck with me. I'm like, no, I'm going to go past 10 years. I'm going to go past 10 years. But if I had kept to the schedule I had, I would never have gotten to 10 years.
Yeah. And again, I mean, I applaud you just for the fact that you had seen those limitations and dealt with them, and not necessarily being supported by the organization. Now, was PTSD something that was openly supported then, and has that changed? Do you think those responses would be different now if you came to them with those concerns?
That's a good question, actually, because I think in my generation, it's very recognized. It's respected, but there's still a amount of the old guys who've been there for 30, 40 years, and they look at you like, well, I did it with less, and it's that, and they just look at you like you're just as pansy, I guess, a little bit. When it's like, no, and because I look at some of the older guys at their personal lives, and I will say it's a direct reflection of a lot of career choices they made. They're on their second, third marriages. They don't have a lot to do with their kids. They have a ton of health problems, and you can't tell me it's not job related.
Oh, I agree with you there. I definitely agree with you there. And that's usually when people don't finally wake up in the process of their mental health or the post-traumatic stress that's really starting to settle in, that's where you start to see the personal life break down, right? You start to see those relationships break down. And the unfortunate thing too, even with the Mounties, was always, it was a joke, right? Oh, what wife are you on?
Yeah.
How much of your pension do you still have?
Oh my gosh,
and it was like a badge of honor for guys to walk around and be like, well, I've only got 25% of my pension. How much do you have? And they were proud of that. And I was like, how is that funny?
Yeah. It's so true. Oh, it's so true. Yeah, it's and you know what, and I have applaud those older guys, because they have seen and done it all, and they did not have the resources we have. They did not have the technology they had. I listen to these older paramedics and the stories they have, man, and I'm like, oh, how you guys are even living and still walking around is amazing, but that comes at a cost.
They are very tough. And again, this isn't to paint the picture that the older generation is doing it the wrong way, but I think our generation is now really starting to talk about this issue and really starting to support it and welcome it. And hopefully when others reach up to even say you, if you ever get promoted and you're in those shoes now where you get to be the caring, compassionate person on the other end of the person coming to you and saying, hey, I need to step back. You can go, I've been there.
And that's what I love. Yeah. I would say that I have coworkers that are younger and they're very quick, like, to say like, yeah, take time off, take whatever you need. Like, and that's been really cool, is that, that's starting to happen more. The younger, I shouldn't even say younger, but some of management is starting to recognize that we need to give people space to go and heal.
Yeah. How supported is this now? And have you seen a change internally in the 10 years that you've been doing it?
I've definitely seen a change. I would say though, it's region to region, I work now in more of an urban center, so there's a little bit more support for that. There's more exposure for that. There's, with more people comes more resources, right? I still have a lot of friends that are rural and that support isn't there, which is very sad. And it's very upsetting because the rural guys are burning out at a really fast rate, because they don't have that support. So I think it's not even time, it's almost area you're in.
Yeah, and I'm sure you're facing as well the classic manpower issues, the financial package issues. And I have always said this, I know here in BC, I can't remember what our paramedics get paid, but it's not much. Really it is. And it might break down to $20, $25 an hour. I can't remember what it is. And they might even have some kind of system where they get paid per call too. So if you're, on a night shift and you don't get any calls, you don't really get paid all that well.
But you're still there.
And that's so unfortunate, right? Like, I mean, these people are insurance plans for keeping people healthy. And we should be celebrating the fact that, yes, we should be dumping the investment into these people. They are there waiting for disasters to happen to go and help you. So I've always been kind of perplexed by that. Our first responders are often not treated the way they should be with the right funding and the right supports. And you see this issue across Canada where the manpower issues, which is probably a very fundamental part to the burnout that we experience in this profession, it's just not there, right? Like you might have a rural community and you might have one or two people servicing a very large area. Like you said, that first call you were at where disaster strikes, the next ambulance is an hour away.
Yeah, and you're on your own for an hour.
And there's nothing worse than feeling alone. Like, I don't know how many times too, even as a Mountie, like I was out in, say, Pemberton, policing Pemberton, and we would get a call for a neighboring reserve. And oftentimes I'd be heading out there alone, knowing that my backup was 45 minutes away. That is a very frightening situation to be in. Like, I can remember a few calls where I was actively going to people that were firing arrows at others. And so you have to go as a police officer. You don't have a choice. You can't wait for backup because you know that somebody could be getting hit by one of these arrows and dying. So you've got to go and try and deal with this. But at the same time, you're going alone and your backup is an hour away.
Yeah, the staffing situation is really hard. And like, especially in the last, I would say 2 years, there's a lot of burnout and a lot of areas that are unstaffed, and that's really scary. And it's funny because I don't even feel for the people necessarily. I feel for my colleagues that are having to deal with that and try to stretch themselves over massive amounts of areas. And exactly, when disaster strikes, they're all alone. And that is when I think it's a breeding ground for PTSD and for mental health, because somehow when you're like, even like I would say the last few years I worked in a more urban center, and there hasn't been nearly as much impact on me mentally because I'm constantly with people. There's, whether I'm with fire crews or I'm with, there's people around constantly, but it's these rural communities and these small little areas where one bad call can be detrimental. And it was in my early days. I have a number of really bad calls where I was on my own, and those are the calls I can recall at the drop of a hat.
the issues of being alone and the lack of connection are very much how that trauma gets deeply rooted into the body, right? And feeling alone. So you're definitely onto something with that. And I've not only seen that from my perspective as doing podcast work now, where people actually talk about, okay, I think there's something here with this lack of connection piece, or this feeling like you're alone when you're going to these hard calls, or generally just not being supported. There's also the component too of the not being supported through work as well. And even I myself, like an old dog who's known a little bit about PTSD now, there's layers to PTSD, which includes your trauma, your traumatic experience. There can be moral injuries, which is something that's not really talked a lot about, which are moments during your career where, morally you're wanting to do X, but because of departmental policies or whatever the case is, you can't do it. So you actually have to go against your morals. And you're nodding your head, so you've obviously experienced this. Those are hard too. They challenge you in those moments. And then you also have layers too of the sanctuary trauma, where you can go to your work and you can say, hey, I'm not doing well, I'm looking for support. And if you don't get that support, then all of a sudden the trauma and the traumatic experience becomes unhealed, unresolved. You might try to shove it down a little bit, and you're not actually encouraging the healing. You're actually suffering more. So work has an onus, definitely, to be there for our people. And yes, the manpower issues are very real. That's not going to be fixed overnight, but we definitely need to see a shift in how we handle our own. And you made a perfect reference to this. We eat our own.
Yeah.
And that has to stop. The older generation that has become so numb and disconnected, and kudos to them for sticking it out. But we've got to stop eating our own. So I really hope you too experience that in your lifetime, that there's a lot more support behind this, and that support will help others navigate the PTSD and begin to heal. What do you think would benefit paramedics right now as a whole to move this PTSD forward, so they're not suffering alone, or what do you think would be something that would help them to get through some of the challenges that you did? Because you've done a very good job of not actually falling into being diagnosed with PTSD. You got ahead of this somehow. A lot of people don't.
I had a luxury.
How did you do that? Like, what was your kind of your success, the recipe to helping you not get diagnosed and not letting things go too dark? Like you had mentioned about the anger and some of the irritability maybe that was surfacing.
Like I said, I had a luxury of being able to step to reduce my hours, and it was a hit. It was a financial hit to do that. It was a pension hit. But it was not negotiable, because as soon as I started to reduce my hours, and I noticed a shift, and I separated what was work and what was life, and this doesn't work for everybody, but I kept work. I don't, outside of work, I don't talk about work. I really have very little to do with colleagues outside of work, if anything, one or two maybe. I really focus on keeping that completely separate. At work, I talk about work, I do work stuff, but outside of work, there's no talk of work. And even if they ask me about work outside of work, I keep it to, I don't say much. I'll say a little bit here and there, but that was important to me, is that I separated that, because as soon as I separated that, I could really start living life again, I felt. And my life just it improved drastically once I separated that, for sure. And I think the problem with paramedics is that we spend a lot of time together, especially if you work full time. You spend a lot of time with your partners. You spend more time with your partners often than you do with your own family. So when you have to go home, my spouse doesn't get what I just did all day. He doesn't understand. So trying to separate that was really hard, because I could go to work and I could identify with everyone at work because we did the same thing all day, all the time. So reducing my work and becoming more, being home more made a big difference. But like I said, that's a luxury not everyone gets to have. And I wish more people did. I don't think any paramedic should never be a full-time job for anybody.
You almost need that approach with first responder type work. where you have to have the decompression time, the time to
Mm-hmm.
heal, the time to have a normal environment that's not the chaos, the constant state of fight or flight or whatever the case is. Did you do anything else, or did you notice anything else about that work-life balance when you started to make that shift that, you know, helped bring you back? And what did you start to notice about yourself? Because I think you touched on the anger. Did you start to see some
Mm-hmm.
of the anger dissipate, and kind of what were some of the healthy things that were coming back now in your life because of that work-life balance?
I became a way better paramedic, believe it or not. I became, I, I didn't have so much compassion fatigue. You've talked about compassion fatigue before in some of your earlier podcasts, and that is, it's, you know, I think it goes pretty close hand in hand. PTSD is compassion fatigue, where I became a great paramedic. I suddenly, when it wasn't my life anymore, and when I was there less, I would connect more with patients, and I became a better, better partner, a better, yeah, like I said, a better paramedic. And I would say over the feeling of having to go outside and scream, like I said earlier, went away. That pent up anxiety and that fear and that that needing to just run away kind of just went away. And I started to look forward to and enjoying going to work more. And my home life was just like, it's so much better. Like my husband will tell you, I became it took a little bit of time, right? But I became a totally different person. I enjoyed people again. I enjoyed going out again. I could laugh again. I didn't just want to watch Netflix all day anymore. Because I was at a point where I did that, where I would lie on the couch all day and just watch Netflix because I was so miserable. I just wanted to forget everything that I was doing and kind of just fall into a different world.
And that's how distinct those worlds can look, right? You can be leading down a path of depression,
Mm-hmm.
anxiety, irritability, negative thought processes, anger, very detached and
Mm-hmm.
disconnected. And now all of a sudden, when you start to make that progress, where you start to see what it is that you actually need in order to be a healthy human being, you can now bring back those immense feelings of empathy and compassion and
Mm-hmm.
be a better paramedic. And now that you have the work life balance, you're a better mother, a better wife, right? You're actually there, you're actually connected, you're not trying to disengage and numb out through watching Netflix or whatever that is. And I mean, that's also kind of hinting too at addiction for some people, right? Just
Mm-hmm.
disengaging from reality and using something is a very early form of addiction. So these things that are now incorporated in your life that help bring you back to your health is fundamental in you actually making sure that you stay resilient
Mm-hmm.
and healthy.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm sure even now, like, you look at being a paramedic now as, I can do this long term. Do you agree?
Oh, 100%. Like I don't feel like I'm on mat leave right now, and I'm planning on going back in a few months, and I don't, I don't feel that deep dread. Like I'll like, I'll go, I'll do it for a couple days, and then I'll go and I'll turn it off, and I'll be mum for a few days, and I'll go back and do it again, and it's there's not that feeling of like I hate this, and I hate people, and I hate the job. And no, it's just it's a job, and that's what it, and I enjoy it for that, you know, reason. But I don't feel that like insane anxiety and that like that feeling in my stomach of like I can't do this.
Yeah. Now, and interestingly enough, too, like what are you noticing in others? You talked a little about this earlier on in the podcast about that glazed over look of that fighter that was at that call. Some of the paramedics that you do know in this space, like, what are you seeing as far as how PTSD is impacting others around you?
I would say, well, first off, all like a lot of home life, like their personal lives, and that makes me very sad. As I'm seeing a lot of marriages fall apart, which is really sad because it doesn't have to be that way, you know. And it's people will say, oh, you know, it wasn't necessarily the job, but I think that's a huge portion of it because that was a huge portion for me. That affected my personal life. Was my job was one of the biggest effects in my personal life, and I would say that seeing that happen has been really hard to see. And just when you get on a call, like oftentimes you'll have a partner and you'll go to a call and you can tell where they're at because of how they'll treat the patient. And that's hard too, right? Because this isn't the patient's fault that my partner has had 20 years of being abused. And and never dealt with it. And that's too bad, right? Because we're in a very trusted position, and people are at their most vulnerable when we're there. Sometimes more vulnerable than even in hospitals, because we are in their homes and we're right in their direct lives, and it's hard to watch people be vulnerable and just to be abused by a sick paramedic or firefighter. Not necessarily sick, but ill, I guess, yeah, mentally ill or tired.
You're right. Tired, sick,
Yeah.
mentally ill,
Yeah.
unwell from their experiences. And that's the unfortunate part too about PTSD, is it will impact you at some point if you're in the field for long enough. And being able to see it in yourself is a very key component to getting ahead of the issue before it gets too big.
Mm-hmm.
Some of us don't learn that lesson until it's too late. And I mean, I think I learned that lesson too late, and that's why I left the Mounties.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm also at peace with leaving. For you were able to catch it quite early on, and now you're able to also give back some of that education, hopefully, to your coworkers. So now, do you find that your position is you're reached out to a little bit more now about mental health? And do people have different conversations with you now that they maybe didn't before? Like, where do you find your role now with that? I'd be interested to hear that.
I actually, it's funny you asked that, because I've had a lot of coworkers reach out to me and say, kind of, quietly nudge me and be like, "Hey, how did you get where you are?" And with the department, and with like to the point where you don't hate it anymore, and what's the steps you took to get where you are? Because I often have people tell me like that there's a couple of us who are in this kind of the position that I'm in, where we saw what was happening to us and we were able to step back. I think there's about 2 or 3 of us, and we often joke amongst the few of us that we're the happiest paramedics in our department, because we come, we do our job, and we leave, and we're not married to the job. But yeah, I've had quite a few reach out to me, just kind of quietly be like, listen, I want to do what you're doing, but how do I go about that?
It's interesting too, like the people that finally reach out when they start to recognize it's, there's a story behind this and it's a real thing, and they're starting to experience it. Can you talk about the fear that exists with that first initial step forward for those people to even come and talk to you? Because that is very much a real thing too, that people are very afraid to step forward and say, to say someone like yourself, "I'm struggling. How did you do this?" And they may actually only give you a small fraction of what's going on. They may nudge you and say, "Hey, how did you do this? I'm asking for a friend," when in reality, they're actually asking for themselves. Like, can you talk about that fear too, to step forward?
Yeah, well, I think I mentioned this a little bit earlier, in the sense that there's a lot of shame that being, especially the younger medics, and the shame of not being able to hack it, like in quotations, hack it, that if you got into this job, you should know what it is. You should just know. And that really bothers me when people say that, because I didn't know. I didn't know. I thought it would just look like it did on Rescue 911, where I would just be the hero all the time, and everybody would live and everyone would survive, and and I would do all these miraculous things. And I would say that I there's a lot of fear that they're going to be ostracized for being weak. And that's, as anybody who's ever dealt with PTSD, that's probably the biggest thing is you're looked at as being weak. And you can't do it. You can't hack it. You can't, you weren't strong enough for this. And it's like, no, it's actually not true at all. We're all human. And just weakness it just looks different for everybody. But yeah, I would say that that fear of basically being ostracized for not being strong.
It's very much there. It's very much in the Mounties too. There's a large portion of, and I don't know if men struggle with this more and women are better at this. I can't really say, but a lot of men are very timid to step forward and say, "Hey, I'm struggling, I'm suffering." And I don't know if that's a sex specific issue. It's so hard to say, but it's one of the things that in order to get to a better place, it's the first step that you have to take for yourself. You have to be willing to walk through your fear and acknowledge, okay, I'm struggling right now. and I need to step forward and connect with somebody about the issues that I'm facing. But I can guarantee you, and you saw this as well, the moment that you do that, you actually invite healing, and you start to look at the problem and you start to problem solve. What do I need? What does my, the beginning stages of my PTSD look like? How do I fix this? How do I nudge myself along so that I can stay healthy? A lot of those people that you see in those chairs now that have 20, 30 years of experience have never gone to do that. And that's so unfortunate, because we've been given this gift of life, and then PTSD robs us of that gift, and it taints everything. All of the very things that come along with the gift, the connections, the spouses, the children, all of those happy moments, it all gets robbed of us. And that's so, so unfortunate. You painted an excellent picture, though, of what it takes, the courage it takes to step forward and get the help that you need. And I can see and I can tell just from having this conversation with you, you're flourishing. You've avoided that silver bullet, the PTSD. And I have nothing but time and respect for you for what you do. All first responders are the same. One is not above the other. I thank you for doing what you do. So thank you for your service and your sacrifice. It's been phenomenal just to sit here and hear your story. Before we wrap this up, because I know how busy you are. You have a few children who are probably starting to open up their eyes upstairs and starting to be like, okay, let's get going. I want to give you an opportunity just to kind of have those closing remarks, or just kind of echo, something that's really powerful about, this journey to you, the part of the story that you really want to share with the world. What is that?
I would say, we touched on this a little bit, is work. It does not have to be your life. You know what? And the work-life balance is key to surviving, especially as a first responder. I think it's being able to walk away when it's starting to personally affect you. And I would say that walking away, there's a cost for sure. You know what? Like, I don't get to go on vacation as much as I'd like to. I don't get to drive a brand new vehicle. My house is great, but I definitely need a kitchen renovation. Whereas if I worked full time, a lot of that I could have a lot of that. But I look at my quality of my life and I'm like, I wouldn't trade this for the world. I get to see my kids grow up, and I get to be present, and I get to be a really good wife and a really good daughter and a good sister. And I wouldn't be that if I hadn't have taken that sacrifice and recognized that, there has to be a balance, because without a balance, you will crash and burn real fast.
The beautiful thing too, and I'm going to echo this just on what you're bringing forward here, the cost that we pay with our lives and our experiences. And you're absolutely right. That's the one biggest thing I learned in my own journey, is that there is always a cost. And while you highlighted the fact that you realized that there was a cost to working full time and not honoring yourself and getting the health you needed, you took that opportunity to step forward and honor yourself and get the things that you needed so you could piece your world back together. So even that gives you a cost, a positive cost coming back to you, where you can now give these gifts back to your children as a mom and as a wife and a daughter, to your family. I'm sure you started to notice too, even your relationship maybe with your family was getting strained too. So these beautiful things that happen, and yes, you're right, there is a cost to not working full time, the kitchen renovation that needs to happen, and the things that you want the money for. But at the end of the day, your health is so valuable. So valuable. And as we age, we start to see that our health is definitely a valuable resource to us. So I applaud you for taking that moment and learning that lesson somehow very early on, and making sure that you're holding your health as important. Thank you for everything you've done as far as your service life goes and finding your way back. That's going to wrap it up for us. I couldn't be more honored to finally have you on here. Paramedics are beautiful people. They go through this stuff too. We need to support them better. We need to help encourage them in their own journeys, because they wear this stuff too. PTSD is an issue that is faced by many first responders. So thank you today for shining a light on the impacts to your world.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us on Season 2. If you are a first responder with an incredible story into post-traumatic stress, please reach out and connect with myself. Season 2 is based on your story. And if you want to step up to the plate and share your story with the world, I would be more than honored to help you do that. Thank you for your continued support with this project, and thank you for tuning in today.